Welcome to another edition of Marriage for Better, for Worse. Hi, I'm Bob Moeller, your host, and in this program, we're going to address the topic, why is marriage on the decline in our culture? Why is marriage on the decline in our culture? We'll get to that and questions related to it in just a moment. Let me remind you, I'm not a professional psychologist, psychiatrist, or certified counselor. I'm a pastor. And I believe that God's Word, prayer, listening, and caring is a formula that God uses to help resolve relationship problems. With that said, let's jump into our topic in this program. Recent studies show that the percentage of adults that are married after age 20 and even after 30 years of age is declining dramatically. In other words, people that are over 20 and those even over 30 that are married, that percentage is declining significantly. In fact, it is down by as much as 33% from 2 decades ago or 3. For the first time in our nation's history, the majority of our population is single rather than married. Well, what's happening? Why is marriage on the decline in our generation? What will happen if this trend continues? There are several reasons, I believe, why the institution of marriage is on the wane, and it appears to be headed in the same direction, even picking up pace. For example, in Europe, some countries today, such as Norway, have a marriage rate of 20% or less. Only 1/5 of the population is married now in Norway, and that figure holds in other European countries as well. Well, the first and foremost reason I believe that marriage is on the decline is the decline of faith in our Judeo-Christian values. As a culture, we are moving steadily away from our heritage of our Western civilization, which was built on Judeo-Christian values as they are found in the Scriptures, both Old and New Testament. For example, over 30% of young people today, young adults, self-identify as secular. That means they say they have no religious faith to guide or instruct their lives. That's the highest percentage we've ever known. That's 1 out of 3 young adults say they have no faith whatsoever. Judeo-Christian values have been taught for thousands of years, and that teaching was rather simple. Marriage is a sacred institution created by God, the only stable environment in which to raise children, and the primary building block of a long-term and secure society. We have believed that for a long, long time. But we have come to reject God in our culture, and as a result, it is no coincidence that we have come to reject the institution of marriage as well, as we have steadily pushed God out of our lives, out of our conversation, out of our education, out of our media, out of our government. Take your choice, as we have become increasingly a secularized society in which we have cleansed all these different institutions of any mention of God. It's no coincidence that at the same time, marriage is on the decline. The second reason I think marriage is on the wane, and we have so many single adults today and older adults, is the sexual revolution that began in the 1950s and in the 1960s. For the first time in our nation's history, permission was given, culturally speaking, to engage in sex and by divorcing it from the institution of marriage. In other words, previous generations always taught that sex was to be practiced within the covenant of marriage, but the sexual revolution said we don't need marriage to be sexually active. In fact, our personal freedom and autonomy, our self-will, our narcissism says we should be able to engage in sexual relations anytime we want, with whoever we want, without the necessity of marriage. With the introduction of, for example, the birth control pill, it became possible for the first time for a woman to engage in a long-term sexual relationship without the fear of pregnancy. Once again, you are now able to build sexually intimate relationships without marriage as a prerequisite. As a result, we have destigmatized sexual behavior outside of marriage, and in fact, the media, in education, in law, we've come to celebrate it. We've come to promote it. We've come to accept it as the norm. In their fallen human nature, which we all have, males in particularly will usually choose sexual behavior devoid of responsibility. In other words, if a man can get sex and not have to bear responsibility for the results, well, to him, that's the best of all worlds. And so with the sexual revolution, now it became possible for him to act out his sexual urges without having to be burdened by providing for a family or raising the children that result. Women in their fallen human nature will use sex to attract men without commitment or covenant. In other words, today women know the sexual power they have, the power of their attraction, and it's being used to attract men, and at the same time saying, come live with me, come sleep with me, and I won't demand a commitment, and I won't demand a covenant. Again, the result is the decline of the institution of marriage. Well, there's another reason. As you can see, all these tributaries are coming together to form this river, which has carried us away from marriage. The advent of abortion on demand allows both men and women to escape the responsibility of raising children from unplanned pregnancies. In previous generations, if a couple discovered they were pregnant outside of marriage, there was going to be a baby, and so often there was a marriage. Today, well, as some people see it, not a problem. We're pregnant, we'll just end the pregnancy, and it's over with. In the past, when this unplanned pregnancy occurred, it led to marriages in order to try and give a child a stable home and a name which only marriage could provide. Well, another factor or two. After the introduction of no-fault divorce in the 1970s, divorce rates soon doubled and even tripled in some places, leaving millions of young children without either a father or a mother in their home. The trauma of living through a divorce led an entire generation, now generations of children, to avoid marriage entirely in order to not repeat their parents' mistake. You know, the old joke, what's the leading cause of divorce? Marriage. Well, that's still true in the sense that you can't get divorced if you were never married. And so the logic is today among young people, let's just live together and not get married. That way we'll never be divorced and have to live through that nightmare again. The result has been an astronomical increase in the number of couples living together. Finally, one more reason why marriage is headed in the tank. The cult of self-fulfillment and self-focus, narcissism if you will, has taught young people to put their needs, dreams, self-actualization before everything else, including marriage. In other words, my education, my career, my car, my dog, it doesn't matter what it is, my phone, it all comes first because I wanted to. Marriage, that's somewhere down the line, quite a bit further down the line. You see, marriage by nature requires that we deny ourselves and sacrifice to meet the needs of another person. That is simply unacceptable thinking in our current me-first narcissistic culture. Unfortunately, and the news doesn't get much better, historians who have studied the rise and the fall of cultures have discovered that previous societies, every society in fact, that abandoned traditional values concerning marriage and restricting sexuality to within marriage, every culture that abandoned that idea started into decline and eventually collapsed within 3 generations after doing so. If you measure a generation by 30 years or thereabouts, And the decline of marriage in our culture began in the early 1960s. How much time do we have left? We've used up at least 2 generations of those 3 before the collapse of a society. Proverbs 14:34 says, "Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin condemns any people." Isaiah 1:4 says this, "Woe to the sinful nation, a people whose guilt is great, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. They have forsaken the Lord, they have spurned the Holy One of Israel, and they have turned their backs on him." I think that says, as succinctly as I know how to, what it means when you abandon the Bible, Judeo-Christian values, and the institution of marriage itself. Let's look at some questions. We have reason to believe our daughter has moved in with her boyfriend at the university they are both attending. She had been living in an apartment nearby campus by herself while she was completing her graduate degree. She told us her boyfriend was renting an apartment in the same complex. Yet, when her younger brother went to visit her recently, her apartment seemed almost empty of furniture and other everyday items. Should we confront our daughter with our suspicion that she moved in with her boyfriend, or just play along until the truth comes out? She was raised in a Christian home, she knows better, and we are just heartbroken. Well, your suspicions are probably correct, and the truth probably will come out someday. Whether sooner or later really doesn't matter, I don't think, because if she is indeed living with her boyfriend, she's made a decision that she's going to continue to do so, and your approval or disapproval, though she might fear it to some degree, did not keep her from making this decision. I think we don't have to play dumb, we don't have to play stupid, but at the same time, I'm not sure that calling her up and confronting her would be in the best interest at the moment. You know something, the truth always does find a way to come to the surface. And sooner or later, she's going to make a mistake. She's going to do or say something. The cat is going to get out of the bag, and it will be abundantly clear that you know. The question is, what will happen when that occurs? Some parents, in order to save the relationship, say nothing and just go along and say, well, she's an adult, it's her choice. I'm not sure that that's the right thing to do. You know, the Bible tells us that if a brother or sister errs, we are to go and show them the error of their way and try and restore them. But we're to do so gently. If they've been caught up in sin, we're to go and confront them, but do so in a spirit of respect and gentleness, lest we fall into that same trap. Here's the tightrope you have to walk. You need to convey to your daughter that you love and accept her, and you always will, regardless of her life choices. But you need to convey also that that doesn't mean you have to accept her life choices, that you have to bless those, that you have to treat those in an unconditional manner. No, we are not to judge or reject one another, but that doesn't mean we can't judge or reject sinful behavior. I think she knows that you disagree. That's why she's continuing the scam as long as she has. I think that when the time comes, you need to be prepared to reaffirm your love for her, but explain why you think her choice is going to damage the future possibility of happiness, even the long-term survival of that relationship should she marry. Because statistics tell us living together does exactly that. There is a time to tell her why. But I would guess at this point, if she's doing this, she's drifted some distance from God. And that's the more important question. Does she know Jesus? Or has she never actually made a commitment to Christ? And her spiritual standing should be of your utmost concern at this point, because until she is a believer, chances are she's not going to come under conviction that something is wrong. I recently read that studies show that if a couple marries when they are young, even 20 or younger, without living together first, they have a better chance of long-term marriage than those who wait to marry, but who live together first. Why is that? Let me say again, a couple that marries quite young, but never lives together or engages in sexual activity first, has a longer, long-term survival rate as a couple than individuals who wait to be much older and live together first. Why is that? Shouldn't more mature people who have actually tried out whether or not they're compatible, shouldn't that be a better bet than a young couple that's naive and doesn't know any better? Well, you see, again, we go back to the wisdom of God, that in God's wisdom, He created the institution of marriage so that young people would, among other things, would have an outlet for their sexual needs without jeopardizing either their own lives or spiritual standing. That, in other words, it wouldn't be sin. God created marriage, and for hundreds, if not thousands of years, people married at an early age. Some historians, biblical scholars, believe Mary, the mother of Jesus, was 15 years old when she married Joseph. Of course, lifespans were much shorter then, so she may have already lived a third of her life by the time she was 15. But see, we have this idea today that the older you are, the wiser you are. That's not necessarily true. And we have this idea that waiting will certainly give us a better idea of who we want to marry than should we marry young. Not necessarily true either. You see, it's more the commitment we're willing to make than the compatibility we achieve that predicts long-term marriage. I have read articles in which people are, serious people, are calling for a return to young marriage rather than waiting till 28, 29, whatever the current figure is. My wife and I have been supporting our son as he's trying to finish dental school. He recently announced his engagement and he plans to be married before his last year of school. We suggested he wait until he graduates, but he said no. He loves his girlfriend and wants to marry her now. I told him if he gets married, my husband told him if he gets married, he will be on his own financially and we will no longer support him. I disagree with my husband and say we should continue to help him until he's finished, even if he's married. Who is right? Well, I don't understand why you would cut someone off just because they get married. Why not support them as they are attempting, and he's certainly making a serious effort to establish himself in his career. Why not continue to do that for a short period of time, not forever, and certainly not if they don't continue in school. But what's the logic of cutting someone off simply because they're married? They still have financial needs. They still aren't in a position to support themselves because they study full-time. Rather, I think you're just increasing pressure. Now, you're not obligated to do that, but at the same time, as a gesture of support and belief in them, why not continue to help them as you're able to? I'm a single and a Christian. I grew up in a divorced home. My mother struggled to provide for us after my father left. My dad cut off all child support when I became an adult. Recently, and this is a woman writing, recently another guy friend of mine offered to let me share an apartment with him and another girl who is a mutual friend. None of us are dating the other. It would save us all money. When I told my pastor that I was going to move in with another man and another woman, all of us single, he said not to do it. I don't understand why. None of us are dating or romantically involved. It makes good sense economically while I'm trying to find a better job and finish school. He said it gives the appearance of evil that Christians are to avoid. I think he's being a little legalistic and out of touch with the times. Well, this may disappoint some people, but I agree with the pastor. For three single individuals to live in the same apartment in close settings where you shower, dress, sleep in your pajamas, all of these different things, to do that with a member of the opposite sex, even if there's another person there, just is not wise. I think you're setting yourself up for temptation I think you certainly are giving the appearance of evil. I know the television show Friends celebrated that kind of idea, that all these single adults would live together, men and women, and enjoy each other's company. But if you remember, part of the plot line of the show was all the sexual relationships that developed. I remember I didn't watch the program. I tuned into it once for a few minutes, and this man comes home, and this other guy's in the bathtub taking a bath. It's a bubble bath, a big bathtub, and then all of a sudden up pops the head of one of the women they're living with, who happens to be his former girlfriend, and that's where the show goes from there. No, I think that even though you may struggle to support yourself and need roommates, why not get 2 other female roommates and divide the costs instead of moving in with a guy? I was having coffee the other day with another single friend of mine. We were discussing whether it's a good idea to have sex with our boyfriends or not. She said we should get to know one another in every area of our lives, including sexually. She came from a home where she taught that it was wrong, but she said, it just seems to make sense. Well, listen, getting to know someone outside of marriage sexually will not tell you whether or not you're compatible, because there is no substitute for marriage except marriage. A boyfriend or a girlfriend is not the same as a husband or wife. Marriage is about commitment, irrevocable commitment, lifelong commitment, willing to live through good and bad, hardship, sickness, and everything else. And just simply having sex with someone to see if you get along is a very bad idea, and in fact introduces negative consequences, negative soul binds that can plague you for years to come. Our daughter has been living with the same person for 10 years now. They have 2 grown children and seem to have a stable relationship. When I mention the idea they should get married, she says her boyfriend doesn't want to. She says it's better this way, as many of her friends who got married are already divorced, and she doesn't want to risk that. That's becoming increasingly common, certainly in Europe, now in the United States, where people form family units, have children, buy houses, all sorts of things, but choose to never marry. We don't know the long-term consequences of that yet, but just think about the children for a few minutes. Who are they? What is their last name? What is their relationship to their parents? Yes, my mother gave me birth and my father conceived me, but what are they? Good friends? Committed domestic partners? I think the confusion that it's going to cause in children's lives, the emotional damage, is going to be huge. I recently had a conversation with 2 women who are raising their children without a father. They each were raised without a father in their home, as was their mother and their grandmother. There have been several generations now where there has never been a father in the home. They told me they don't need a man to raise a family. They're strong enough to do it by themselves. They believe it's a sign of strength and resilience to raise children on their own and not need a father to help. Can the value and institution of marriage actually die out after several generations? Well, I think that is possible, that you can, after several generations of no marriage, come to adapt to the idea that men are optional and that actually it's a virtue to be able to raise children all by yourself. The question is, what is the cost to the children and to society when we adopt that particular issue? We know from the studies, a mountain of studies, the impact of fatherlessness on both young men, boys, and girls. That young men they themselves go out and start experimenting with sex with women simply to try and discover their male or masculinity. Girls will go out as teenagers and begin engaging in sexual activity and even have children because they're looking for the love of a man. And with that, the pathologies that come from a fatherless home have really begun to show themselves in crime, drug usage, poverty, any number of sad trends. Yes, if we don't guard the institution of marriage, if we don't revitalize it and see the value, it can die out, but the consequences could be catastrophic. My mother lives in a retirement village in Florida. She's a widow now, but enjoys living independently, has no plans to remarry. On a visit to see her, she recently told me that a number of senior adults who are widows or widowers, some in their 80s, have moved in together. I was stunned. I thought the older generation still believed in no sex outside of marriage. What in the world has happened to our society if even grandma and grandpa are shacking up with one another in Florida? Well, I think it's an overall decline, a lack of confidence and faith in the institution of marriage, which I discussed in the early part of this program. And it is true, senior citizens are moving in together with one another without getting married, as it has become increasingly destigmatized. I've been reading the Old Testament, and it says the reason God drove out the pagan nations and gave Israel the promised land is that these nations engaged in detestable practices, including sexual promiscuity within families with one another, among neighbors, and even as an act of worship at their pagan temples. He warned the Israelites not to practice any of these things, or they too would be driven from the land. Does that have any application to our society today, or was that just an Old Testament cultural law no longer in force? Well, that's a real good question. The truth of the matter is the moral principle behind that prohibition still stands, because moral prohibitions are based on the character of God, and God has not changed. It's not that he's going to necessarily push a people out of their land as he did in the time of, say, Joshua. It's that the society itself will collapse under the weight of the denigration that sexual promiscuity and the detestable practices he describes continues. Well, our program is nearing its end. And again, we wish to thank you for joining us. It's an honor that you are with us each week as we look into God's Word to try and understand His perspective, His eternal wisdom that He is contained in the Scriptures regarding marriage and family issues. Until next week, and again, we invite you to join us. Remember, marriage is for better, for worse, and for keeps.